Warm welcome, everyone. I'm Lisa Witter, the co-founder of Apolitical. I'm sitting here in Berlin, Germany. We have people from around the globe joining us today for the lost art of connecting. Before I tell you a little bit more, let's everyone turn on their cameras, everyone around the world, just for a minute. Amanda, come visit me anytime, just for a minute. We're gonna wave at each other like real human beings, right? So let's go ahead, let's start that wave. You can click around. I see Kathleen and Julie and Guy, your real public servants, Gabby, Eric, Julie, Jacqueline, Emile, Jessica, so many people. Someone's dancing, there you go, Francis, I can see you, Carly, Cesar, all over. If you haven't yet, do introduce yourself in the chat. We wanna get a sense of this global community here at Apolitical that's here to support each other as public servants. So I'm super excited to facilitate, I prefer DJ, this workshop on the lost art of connecting. Or if you think about it another way, how to develop better connections, understanding, and lifelong relationships in the public sector, not only to help grow your career, which is, we know, important, but we know also public sector folks, I'm a former one myself, I worked in government too, are really driven by the intrinsic, sort of that inner motivation to help the citizens. So how can you help use this lost art of connecting to not only help you at work, but with the communities that you serve? For those of you joining for the first time, Apolitical is a global learning network for people in government. We have more than 125,000 members from 170 countries. And we provide free online learning and content for public servants and policymakers around the globe. We have new workshops and boot camps almost every week. And it's by and for, so 100% of our content is by public servants. And we kind of get up every day with you in our hearts, how we can serve you so you can serve the citizens. So today we're fortunate to have Susan McPherson. Susan, can you wave at us? Who knows Apolitical very well. Penny Abdurrana. Penny, can you wave at us? There you go, with the beautiful earrings there. And Farah Mohammed. Farah, here you go. But before I introduce them, I want to see how you think about this topic. So we've got a couple polling questions. So Helen, my colleague Helen Caldwell, if Helen, you can wave. The first poll up is, how has the last year and a half, assuming that you've been in some sort of lockdown with COVID, been for you regarding connecting to people? I loved it. I loved avoiding people. This is good for me. I've mostly enjoyed it. I like it and I don't like it. I hated it, but adapted, and I hated it and can't wait to get back into the office and get back to cocktail parties and water coolers and all those things that we do. Welcome. I see some new people. We have Yosi Ward from Sussex. Toronto's in the house. Fantastic. We'll give you a minute. Hello, Cherry. Nice to see you. Great. So there are some of you, you could be introverts, or you could have just loved this, a break. You loved avoiding people. 22% mostly enjoyed it, but most of you liked it and didn't like it, Susan. I'd be curious when you start talking sort of the global sense check you've had on this. I hated it, but adapted, and I hated it and can't wait to get to life as normal. So only 1%. So I think there's something out of this that we can pull. Okay, next question. Thanks everyone for responding. Over the past 12 months, have you felt more or less connected with your colleagues? More, much more, somewhat, about the same, somewhat less, much less, or something else? You can put that in the chat. Thanks for the reminder to go in gallery view if you want to see all the little squares of 101 of you beautiful people from around the world. Okay. Amanda, I started a new job and meeting them for the first time in person today. Yeah, lots of people. I've hired and not met people. Daphne started in a new position too. So a lot of first joiners. Thanks, Susan. Okay, survey says, so 30% of you said somewhat less connected and much less connected. So a majority of you are feeling less connected, Susan. And we know that you do better work when you feel connected to people. particularly in the authentic way that you're going to talk about. Some people feel more connected. So when we get to the Q&A, we're going to want to hear more about those of you who have managed to feel more connected in your work. Okay, let's turn to our fantastic experts and speakers. So Susan McPherson, who is the author of this fantastic book, The Lost Art of Connecting. I've known Susan for, I don't know how long now, a long, long time. And she is the most genuine serial connector I've ever met. She does everything from her heart and with purpose. She's an angel investor and does a lot on corporate social responsibility. She's the founder and CEO of McPherson Strategies, and she's done so many great things on storytelling and partnership creation around building brands that really make a difference, and so much more. Penny, has this awesome job. I think you have one of the best jobs in the world, is the New York City's Commissioner for International Affairs. Now, as many of you know, New York City, my former hometown, I lived there for a long time, hosts the UN. So she gets to do like real diplomacy and leads the city's platform doing that. And she's been a big proponent of the global goals. If you could pop in the chat, if your government works on global goals, it'd be really interesting just to get a sense of who's there, and has really put accessibility and diversity really at the front of her work. And then last but not least, again, another fantastic tri-sector leader, former public servant from Canada. She's worked in every sector. And she's done a lot with women and girls, including being the CEO of the Malala Fund. And she's a global advisor to the Apolitical Foundation as well, which we work on. I'm now the CEO of the foundation working on the Building Better Politics to go along with you fantastic public servants. So I'm going to turn it over to Susan. Just want to say one more time, I see there's new people that join. Make sure you do introduce yourself in the chat so we get a sense of who you are. So Susan, over to you.
Thank you, Lisa. And for those who might have missed it, I put in the chat that Ms. Witter should really, truly win Zoom Presenter of the Year, because all of us have been on thousands probably of these, and I have seen no one do a more articulate, beautiful job of presenting, introducing, making people feel welcome. And I have to say, it is a joy to be with you all. I will also admit that I'm actually nervous because I am alongside three of my most incredibly trusted and beautiful friends that do such good in the world. And I also just want to say to everyone here in the audience, each one of you in the work that you do in government and civil service are doing such important work. And I think sometimes we don't give enough gratitude and thanks to those of you who have chosen the path of public service, but we owe so much to the good work that you're doing. So please know that while I'm giving this presentation, I'm also giving gratitude to you all. So just a quick note on me. I have been a serial connector since the late 60s when I was 5 or 6 years old. And it wasn't until 2007 when I was actually with Lisa Witter at a weekend offsite where the goal of that offsite was to develop our elevator speeches, or what our secret sauces or superpowers were. And it was thankfully, thanks to her and 7 other incredible women, that I got the guts to actually state, I am a serial connector. And of course, right after I said that, I wanted to pee in my pants because it sounded so ridiculous, but it was the culmination in, at the time, probably 40 some years of my life. So just a quick note, Apolitical is actually a platform where you are all doing connecting every single day. So probably some of the information I'm going to share is something you're already doing. So I'm just going to give you some quick tidbits and bits from my book and my experience, and then we'll jump into the actual conversation, which I think will be even more valuable. So long before the pandemic, I was talking about the lost art of connecting. I felt there was an overemphasis on technology, the clicks, the likes, the followers, and I thought the humanity was gone, myself included. And this horrific pandemic, as we know, there are some silver linings, and looking at the polling actually makes me realize that. I do believe that because we were so isolated, we used our technology to connect more meaningfully, because technology became the means to not only connect, but actually build our meaningful relationships. But just a few stats. In December of 2020, 72% of Americans felt they had a strong desire for more human interaction during the pandemic. And that was an illuminating, pervasive sense of loneliness that no doubt has had dire effects on all of us. But globally, 2 in 5 people, 41%, report becoming lonelier over the past 6 months, while 1 in 5 have become less lonely. Countries where the highest proportions of people have become lonelier include Turkey, Brazil, Belgium, Canada, and Great Britain. So those are just some facts to start off. If you could turn to the next slide, Helen. So I want to also acknowledge, we know that people are indeed getting vaccinated, but it is not universal. And there are many people probably in the audience that are still extraordinarily isolated. So I want to acknowledge you because, you know, even though some of us, certainly in the United States right now, are further along, it can't be easy. So I again, my heart goes out to you, and I'm hoping and praying that things get improved as soon as possible. Just a quick note, I'm going to give you some tools that will help you approach connecting. And I also want to just delineate the difference between connecting and networking. We all have to network, there's no doubt, but if you look up the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition of networking, it's work. And I believe that connecting is natural, it's human, it's kind, it's filled with vulnerability and empathy, and it's not 1 to 100, it's 1 to 1, 1 to 2. So for the introverts in the audience, it should be a little bit more approachable. Next slide. So just a quick question for all of you, and we didn't do this in a poll, but if each of you can just give 10 seconds to this question, what is a meaningful relationship to you? Because for every single person, it is very, very different. For me in my lifetime, it has been someone who has shown up in the good time and the bad. Someone you can tap for advice, for support, for help, but also someone you can support and advise and connect to others. And just a little backstory. I learned this early on at the at the breakfast table. And 50 years later, I've made it my calling card. And I would advise you all, when you think about building relationships and connections, try to think of it like a constellation. If we look back at antiquity, when people would look up in the sky, they would try to make sense. They would try to create stories and tapestries when they would look up and see all the lights across the horizon. Well, I like to think when we connect people, when we introduce people, when we make those connections happen, we're actually creating stories. We're creating impact. We're creating funding for organizations. We're, helping pass bills in legislatures around the world. So in other words, I want you to think of it as less of a static network and more of concentric circles. Through Apolitical, you have access to a wonderful community of like-minded civil servants. And you do have a common goal of supporting each other, sharing each other's innovations and ideas, and advancing impact all over the world. So you are already guided by this mission. I don't think I'm teaching you anything new. I'm just hoping to spur you to be a little bit more intentional about your connections. Next slide, please. So my parents were blind to the difference between coworkers, friends, family. People were people, and each one was worthy of connection, depth, and care, meaning no matter who they were, where they came from, their cultural heritage, their age, their race, all of them were deserving of attention and care and compassion. So that very much grounded me, and it also filled me with a life of curiosity to learn more about the outside world, not only so I could learn about others, but learn more about myself and what I didn't know. And I think of that when I'm building a connection. So think of it this way, a connection doesn't end. If it ends, it's a business transaction. So when you think about connections, think about ongoing reciprocity, not a one and done that you put on a bookshelf. Next slide. So let's get into brass tactics. In my book, I have a methodology called Gather, Ask, Do. And I'm going to go so bold as saying we are living at a time where we're all more connected in some ways because we've lived through this pandemic. And other than global climate change, which is obviously affecting all of us, there's not a whole lot that really truly binds us, depending on where we are in the world. But this pandemic in some ways did. So I think as we start to emerge from it, we have a do-over opportunity. We actually have a chance to reset. And I'm 56 years old, and I can tell you, I've never really had a true opportunity to reset. I mean, obviously I've had fits and starts and job changes, but this is a real moment in time. So with that said, the methodology in my book starts with Gather. And part of Gather is doing a connection with yourself and thinking about what are the goals that you want to reach, meet, aspire to in the next 4 years, 4 months, 4 weeks. And when you think about that, what are the connections that you want to make that are going to help you reach those goals? Whether they be reconnecting with people you've lost touch with or new connections. And what are you going to do in your power, by any possibility, to break out of the bubbles that you've been in and meet people who aren't like you, aren't the same age as you, aren't the same race and cultural heritage? And lastly, what are your superpowers, strengths, chief differentiating factors that you can bring to others? Because the one level set throughout the entire book is flipping networking on its head with the mantra, how can I help, rather than what can I get? And we can only be helpful to others if we learn what our superpowers are. Every single one of you has superpowers, multiples of them. And like I said, back in 2007, I finally admitted my lead superpower. Once you get past the gather phase, you can get to the ask phase. And the ask phase is learning to ask the meaningful questions of others so that you can understand what are their hopes and dreams and challenges and, dare I say, problems. And if you listen carefully to them when they are speaking, which is very, very hard for all of us, myself included, then you can get to the phase that I love the most and the phase that I like being in the most, and that is the do phase. And that is where you take all the data that you listen to and you act upon it. You connect people, you support people, you help people. And something tells me, given the work that you all do as civil servants, this is also where you like to be, the doing, the getting the proverbial SHIT done. And the reason I'm not swearing is I was on a podcast recently and they told me at the beginning of the podcast, no swearing allowed. So now I'm so paranoid. All right, next slide. And then we'll race through these so we can get to the conversation. So I explained the gather, ask, do. And I want to reiterate that importance of resetting our mindset to leading with, how can I help? When you meet people, when you reconnect with people, if you ask them in a true, meaningful way, how can I help? From an authentic space, obviously, you are opening yourself up to a deeper conversation. You are being more human. And quite frankly, given the year that we've had, dare I say, we all could use a little help. It also says, I am interested in you. I am here for you. And I truly fundamentally believe, and in all the research I did for the book, that is an essential framework to really approach all relationships. You're not going to lose. And people often say to me, Susan, how do you there's only a certain amount of hours in the day. How do you help everyone? This isn't about not taking the oxygen mask first. You're actually helping yourself when you help others. Next slide. And just to make sure we're on the same, it's nurture your relationships. When I mention gather, ask, do, I want to state that this actually is not a one and done. This is something you can do many, many times in your lives. And I think, and I'm not just trying to sell books, I honestly think for those of you who are just starting your career, or those of you who may be approaching retirement, It's a healthy exercise to kind of run through, especially when you're in a change, starting a new job, looking for a new job. Next slide. This is my favorite slide because it's so animated and it makes me look like I know how to create amazing animation, but I must give credit to a wonderful animator. Be vulnerable. Sometimes this is the scariest thing. And for those of you who lead organizations or lead departments within governments, we can't expect our employees and our colleagues to be vulnerable if we are not going to lead with vulnerability first. In the United States, which is where I live, there's all this talk about people bringing their full selves to work. Well, I'm going to say that many people don't feel comfortable to bring their full selves. And the onus is on leaders to make them feel comfortable, to give them space to feel comfortable. And I do believe that after this last year and a half, the idea of meaningful connections at work is no longer going to be relegated to the annual sales conference or the monthly happy hours, and will become more part of a core business function. Because research shows if employees are more connected, more deeply connected, even dare I say friends at work, they are more productive. They are much more likely to stay at the company and the organization. They are much more likely to recommend that their friends come and work with them. So the proof is in the pudding that building meaningful relationships at work actually drives productivity. So just a couple of tips here. Let's get off the weather talk. I lived in Denmark when I was in college in 1985. I was attending the University of Copenhagen. And my Danish father used to always say to me, Susan, you Americans, you don't like silence. And to fill the silence, you talk about the weather. And I have to tell you, over the last 30 years, every event, every Zoom room, every conference call, somebody leads with the weather, and then everybody starts talking about the weather. Let me say this, let's get off the weather. Let's talk about something more meaningful. Let's talk about where in the world do we want to go when we get out of this pandemic? Or where or what problem could you solve if money wasn't an equation in the world? These types of questions actually help us be more vulnerable with one another and help drive conversation. Next slide. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because there are plenty of experts that you all can be listening to learn how to be better listeners. But I will suggest that in the research for my book, I listened to a number of Dr. Julian Treasure's TED Talks. He is a renowned expert on listening. And one thing he suggested is that I now take to heart is when we are listening, try not to do reactive listening, meaning when you hear the person talking and you're paying attention, we tend as humans to go to how we're going to respond, but try to stop that muscle and just truly listen. And in the ask phase of my book, I talk about listening to others as you ask them the meaningful questions. It is really important to listen to their answers so that then you can truly be of help. Next slide. And I hope you notice I'm going through these very quickly so we can get to the conversation, which is the best part. Acknowledge everyone in the room. I bring this back to my parents teaching me that every single person, no matter the role they play at your job, in your neighborhood, in your communities, they all have chief differentiating factors. They all have immeasurable things to offer society. And next slide. And I'm going to actually just skip because I really want to get to the conversation because I think everybody in this room wants to hear from the whole crew. On slide 12, this is all about reciprocity. I want to remind everyone here what I said at the beginning of the presentation, that this is not a one and done, that relationships last the test of our lifetimes. And Lisa and I have known each other for close to 20 years now. So that is an example. And why don't we go down to slide 14? You all have the tools to become super connectors, even if it means connecting with 5 people, even if it means turning FOMO into JOMO, which is the joy of meeting others, as opposed to the fear of missing out or the joy of missing out. And last but not least, I'm going to turn it over to the panel. And I want to thank you all for listening to me and look forward to chatting with Penny and Farah and Lisa.
Super. Thank you, Susan, so much. We had a lot of activity in the chat, and maybe some questions I'll come back around some gratitude and how do you balance taking care of yourself while looking out for other people, which is hard to do. So we'll come back to that. But before we do, we want to put people in breakout rooms, and this is your chance to meet someone with this new mentality. So we're not talking about the weather. You're going to ask questions. You're going to have some joy, JOMO. That was the first time I heard of that. Joy of meeting others. Yeah. I love it. Joy of meeting others. I'm going to send that out to the world. So we're going to put you in groups of 4 just for 10 minutes. Meet each other, thinking about this authentic place, how you can help, what you're looking for, and we'll come back. Welcome back, everyone. I see people are slowly joining. Just saw Amanda for a moment. Popped in there. Hello, Bruce. And Renya. There we go. Super. So welcome back. You're popping in. So maybe quickly, if you can pop into the chat one thing about someone you just met. Just one thing. You don't have to say who it was, but just one thing about someone you just met. Just get a sense of how good of a listening we were and how good we were at talking. I think that's the biggest thing for me is like, how do I really deeply listen and not with a need to respond right away, but deeply listen. So Farah and Penny, I want to bring you into the conversation with a question that Marsha has. You two both are serial, authentic, genuine connectors. You've both gone far in your career in government because of that and beyond, right? It's been a big part of your job. I mean, Penny, where would you be in your role without connecting? So I'm curious, either what part of Susan's method do you use the most and sort of rings most true for you? And if you have any of like your own spins on it. And B, Marsha Charles asked, you know, Susan talked about your parents said there's no difference. People who work together or they go to school together, they go to church, whatever it is, like they're all just people. There aren't these boundaries between the roles. And Marsha's like, but people always keep telling us to keep boundaries. So Farah and Penny, over to you on either that question or what you find true of the method. So Penny, you first.
I think I'm going to take on the boundaries question because that's in particular true in government, right? there are boundaries imposed on the way that we can connect with our coworkers. You know, there's a lot of how we need to ensure that people feel safe and included in our work environment. And so that also means when you're networking with other city agencies and other colleagues, I incorporate what, Susan's method of, I try not to have boundaries, recognizing how careful I have to be navigating all of that. So very formally, I build relationships with ambassadors and consuls general, and part of the appeal to collaborate and to partner is having, finding our joint, overlap around values. So something that, when I was first appointed, I was doing a lot of courtesy meetings, and we host 193 permanent missions. We have, I have a different way of connecting with different countries based on, how they are on human rights issues. But the key has been trying to figure out what our common alignment is, right? If it's not human rights, perhaps it's climate, and being able to figure out how we can work sort of authentically around that. But some of it also is, I share a lot about, my son. I'm a newish parent with a 5-year-old. And so I find that has been one of the ways that I navigate the boundaries, but just recognizing when you do that, you have to be extra careful. But people appreciate when they recognize that you're trying to circumvent these boundaries and trying to do it in a thoughtful, strategic manner in that sense too.
So the blending and finding the values that bring us together. Maybe we'll, after this question, ask the question about cultural differences in connecting, because Penny, I'm sure you've had to do that far. You you've done that throughout your whole career. You being a person coming to Canada as a refugee and fitting in, and then working globally with people around the world. So far, how about you? What question would you like? Is you want to talk about the cultural question, the boundaries question, or a method that you use from Susan's? Oh, you're muted, love.
You know what? It's so funny. I never do that, and here I am muted. Probably a muted Farah sometimes is not a bad thing. But listen, I think for what Susan said, of all the things and all the tips and tactics that she gives us, I think the one that is super important is the listening tactic. And I'm going to relate this back to working in government, and there's a reason. So I spent 10 years on Parliament Hill. I was a political staffer to Anne McCollum when she was the Minister of Justice, Health, and then Deputy Prime Minister. And before that, I worked in the Member of Parliament's office. And when you're in the political part, and many of the people on this call are Canadian and they work in departments, if political staff didn't listen, to actually listen to the advice that was coming from departmental people who had expertise, who had been there for a long time, you could get yourself into a lot of trouble. So I think there's a very important, it's not just about the connection. Susan, I think you'd agree, it's actually, it's the connection, it's learning, it's adapting, it's understanding when you should just shut up and listen. And then it's actually keeping yourself out of trouble. So I think there's a very real lesson in listening. And I'll give you another example. So in my breakout room, I was speaking to somebody and I said, so where do you work? And she said, the Ontario Science Centre. It's midday, I hope you don't mind. And I said, oh, I used to be on the board of the Ontario Science Centre. And right there. And then she said, her family came from Haiti. I said, oh, I've been to Haiti. And we had, in that short amount of time, we listened to one another and we riffed off one another. So Susan, I think people take it for granted. When you pass the street, you say to somebody, how are you? And you don't listen for the answer. Somebody can be saying, oh, I feel like crap, or I'm not happy or something. And you just have a good day. And that's the part that bothers me the most, but it's also the most empowering part. I can't tell you how much I've learned from listening to people. I want to give you another short example. I met Lisa because I was stuck in London after the Skull World Forum in 2010. And Penny said, Farah, you're stuck there. You should meet Lisa Witter. Lisa Witter and I met in a hotel in London. And Lisa and I both discovered after listening to one another that we share the same birthday. I'm older. Anyway, we've since been friends since that 2010. She introduced me to Susan. And then Lisa introduced me to the search firm where I got my job with the Malala Fund. Yeah. Because we had one meeting because Penny connected us and we listened to one another. That is where I think the magic happens. Those are my two examples. I think hopefully that sort of wraps up what do I think of all the different tidbits. Listening, I think, is number one.
Well, can I riff off that just a second, Farah? Thank you for sharing that. It's for me, it's listening with love. That's the hippie response. Yes. But I think the less hippie response is listening with curiosity, like genuine curiosity. Like someone will say, you're a good networker. I'm like, I'm not, I just really am curious about people. That's like that.
My mom says it's because I'm nosy. My mom's like, you might be curious and nosy. And so I'm like, okay, I'll take that. But you're absolutely right. It is curiosity that will either open your mind and have you listen or not.
And
also it's funny how networking or being seen as a strategic or like successful networker is like a bad thing. It's like, actually, if people see you in that light, it's actually a good thing. That means you're doing it well. And Susan, this is what I love about your book, is it's like how 15 years ago, people used to be very dismissive of like development professionals. Oh, fundraisers, they're over there doing that thing. And really it needed to be professionalized to be valued. One of the most critical functions in a lot of organizations are the development staff. And so I think there's an aspect of networking that also just needs to be valued and not disparaged.
Well, for the introverts in the audience or the shy folks, I have something I call the Triumvirate. So when you go into a Zoom room or when we are back in some sense of normalcy, go with the goal of meeting 3 people, sharing 3 things about yourself, as vulnerable as you can be, and learning 3 things about others. And that way, for people who are shy or the big room is terrifying, that is feasible, doable. And then you can go hide in the bathroom. But I also want to share this notion, and riff off what my wonderful co-panelists said, and this notion of listening. I think it's also to get rid of our preconceived notions, because we all have them. It's human. And I learned back in 2016 a very important lesson, which I will just share because it has global implications. And this is very much a global audience. In the middle of the afternoon of a very busy day at my company, McPherson Strategies, I received an email from a friend that said, "Dear Susan, my friend Brant, who's a filmmaker, wants to get into a refugee camp tomorrow in Lesbos, Greece." Okay, just to level the playing field, one of the boards I serve on is the US arm of the UN High Commission for Refugees. So it wasn't so out in left field. But all I kept thinking were two things. One, I'm super busy, and it's very hard to get somebody in a refugee camp. And two, really, does the world need another documentary film about refugees that no one's going to see? But I had 20 minutes and I said, you know what? I'm going to see if I can make this happen. I was able to get this fella in the camp. The next week, I learned that Brant Anderson, who was the individual, is not a documentary filmmaker, but a big budget Hollywood producer and director who had done a number of Tom Cruise films. He became enamored and compassionate about the refugee cause. A month later, a friend who was an advisor to CARE reached out to me and said, "Susan, do you happen to know any filmmakers who might be willing to go spend 2 weeks on the Syrian border at a refugee camp to help teach Syrian youth how to make films to tell their stories of how they fled so the world can find out and also help them psychologically?" Guess what? I had the phone number. I called Brant. Within 5 minutes, not only did he say yes, but he brought 8 other Hollywood filmmakers with him. They spent 2 weeks at the Azraq camp on the Syrian border. Those kids learned how to make films. Because of that, Epic Foundation, which is a pretty ginormous foundation in the United States, made a grant that created a film academy at that refugee camp. But there's more. Brant went on to raise millions of dollars for UNICEF, for UNHCR, for Doctors Without Borders, for CARE. And even more, he created a narrative feature film called Refugee that Angelina Jolie happened to see and now is taking to world leaders everywhere to help make them realize that there are still 88 million displaced people in the world. I'm not going to take credit for all of that happening by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm glad I got rid of my preconceived notions. I'm glad I made connecting a priority, because I think just in that span of time, the good that came out of the connections. So I listened, but I also connected.
So great, Susan. I'd like to that's so great. And this gets me to a bit of a speed round. I want to ask the three of you. So I'll just popcorn this out quickly, some questions that have come in. So Penny, how useful is LinkedIn in a sentence for making connections for you?
Oh, good question. I think it is. I don't know about making connections, but I do think it's been very effective sharing information. I have to say, the way that incoming comes in on LinkedIn, it's really hard to navigate. But if you do want to just share out there, that could then end up being important in connections. LinkedIn's been very valuable.
Farah, you've worked a lot with young girls and building their leadership and their power. And so one of the questions that came in early was, any tips on how to build rapport and connections if you're younger with older people or people in positions of power? Have you seen anything with Malala clearly with a position of power, but with young people?
Yeah, it's interesting. My boss was 18 years old, so that was kind of interesting when that happened. But look, I think you have to be open to people's experiences, right? So an 18-year-old might have an experience that an 80-year-old can actually, respond to. I think we have these, as Susan had said, preconceived notions that just because you've got a couple of decades between you, you can't relate to something. So you might relate differently. You might see things differently, but it doesn't mean you can't relate. Loneliness is a perfect example. An 18-year-old can feel lonely, and so can an 80-year-old. Right? It's my perfect example. So I think you've got to be able to understand, and particularly with young girls. So Girls 20 was all about bringing girls from different countries together. And culturally, there were some girls that, were not comfortable speaking up or connecting. the first thing we would do when we got these young women together, and some of the stuff I learned from government, was you put them all in a circle. They just say their first name, and then they go around, and I shook every one of their hands. And you could tell from the way that they shook a hand if they were super confident, if they were a little more timid. So I think it's also a body language. And now we don't shake hands. We got to come up with something else. But yeah, the elbow thing, sure. But I do think that there's something to be said about different generations, understanding that just because you're a different age doesn't mean that you don't relate, or just because you're from a different culture, going back to your other question, doesn't mean that you don't share some of the same challenges, opportunities. It's just the way you go about it. I had young women who had never been on a plane before, and some young women who had flown around the world by the time they were 24. And when you put them all in the same room, there was a magic there. Because why? They connected because they were compassionate, they were curious, they listened. They didn't expect anything in terms of reciprocity. And Susan, you talk a little about this in your book, right? You talk about when you connect, you do it without the expectation of reciprocity. For people in government, for people in the public service, I think apolitical, even when you connect department to department, and I used to see information being shared between departments, there was a hesitancy, but I think that's been opened up. I think people want to learn from one another and not fear that if they share information, they might get into trouble. So I think that there's generational, there's cultural, there's, moving from one department to the other, and understanding that you all come with either 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years of experience, but it's not where you are sitting in that moment that defines who you are.
Thank you, Farah. I want to put up thank you, everyone. We're at the top of the hour already. That went so fast. So Helen, go up and put up the last poll question. Cherry, while we're putting that up, talks about how do we connect genuinely in the workplace. I believe that civil servants won't be completely empowered until they can be their full people in the workplace, not just bureaucrats. So there's work to do in changing structure. So what's your outlook for the future, everyone? The people who can genuinely connect with others will be the new alchemists, the gold makers, the magicians in our societies. Connecting with people won't be as important in the future because tech will mostly replace the need for network. It'd be like precision, like AI will tell you the one person you need to meet. That's all you need to do. The need for connecting with people will stay the same. Just how you connect will continue to change, or something else. Go ahead and respond to that. We'll quickly take a look at that. Helen at the end is going to pop in to the chat some upcoming events that we have if you want to keep on learning. Let's see, Helen, and the answer is, wow, people who can genuinely connect with others will be the new alchemist, and nearly 50% said will stay the same, just the methods will change. So I'd like to everyone quickly put your one-word takeaway in the chat. Then we're going to go to that gallery view one more time. And we're going to wave at one another to say goodbye. Vulnerability, says Veronica. Listening, says Amanda. Listen. Gratitude. Appreciating others. Sharing. Connecting. Curiosity. Connecting versus networking, Maria. Grateful. Active listening. Compassion. Curiosity. Generosity. Authenticity. It's so beautiful. Listening without an agenda. Yeah. From heart with purpose. Do, says Tim. So I want to thank Susan McPherson for her life's work in writing this book and so much more. For Farah for joining with her experience, not just in the Canadian public service, but in general as a change maker across the world. And Penny for her life's work as well, and most recently with New York City. So let's everyone, thank you for joining, and let's everyone do a quick wave of a hand. We'll follow up with the deck and resources. Let's be real people with one another. Thanks for connecting. Thanks for being curious. Thanks for being genuine. Stay safe and see you next time. Bye, everybody.